In chapter 33, we'll be looking at Australia and how its geography has created it as a country in isolation and different from everyone else. Our essential question for the chapter is, how does a country's location shape life within its borders? Now, most of us know Australia as the land down under, and we recognize Australia by its accent, koala bears, kangaroos, and some of its exotic animals that we may think of. What we don't usually think of when we think of Australia is how its geography has shaped it and its culture to be the way that it is. And so that's what we'll be looking through and at as we look at Australia in chapter 33. Now we notice that here's the rest of the world outside, and our map looks a little bit different. We're used to seeing the United States and South America on this side, and then Europe and Russia along with Asia on this side. What they've done is kind of flipped it around for us so that we see Australia in the center. This was supposed to be a video. Unfortunately, I cannot get it to play on this video on this screencast. What you can do on here, though, after the video is done, go to YouTube, search the top 10 destinations when visiting Australia, look for the video that begins with this waterfall, and it'll run you through there. The geographic setting of Australia. At this point here, what I'd like you guys to do is pause the video, read section 1 and 2 about Australia. By this point, you should have read those two sections. Something that you'll learn about Australia is that Australia wasn't always where it currently is at. If we look over here in the very top left-hand corner, you'll see this is an image of Pangaea. Pangaea was a supercontinent, and it is believed that millions of years ago that all of the continents were contained into one supercontinent that they call Pangaea. We see Europe, North America, Africa, South America. Australia would have been into this portion somewhere here. There's good evidence that proves that this is true. One of the things that we see is right here in this area, in this portion of Africa and in this portion of South America, similar fossils from dinosaur bones are found. The other thing is, if we just look at the shape of them, especially down here on these lower maps, like in this area, you see that it looks like South America would fit into Africa. So it seems to make sense. Now, one of the things you also notice is that North America takes on a drastically different shape. And as a result of the continental drift theory, which is shown on this map down here, you see that the continents are ever so slowly shifting apart from each other. And if we look at this map down here, we're looking at it like this, to where we're currently at right here. Now, each year, all of these continents move apart from each other, and they're really moving this way and this way, millimeters, centimeters, or inches at a time, depending on how the continental drift is taking place, how much the tectonic plates are moving. Now, you remember you learned about the tectonic plates in an earlier chapter, in that the tectonic plates are always moving, and they're really moving apart from one another. Now, as a result of this continental drift theory, you see that this area right here, that's Australia. All right, we can see it over here as well. And you see Australia moving apart from everyone else. And this took place about 130, 140 million years ago. And so you figure for 130 or 140 million years, Australia has been growing in isolation. And this is going to help to explain the unique biodiversity of Australia. So if we look at here, the koala bear, the kangaroo, and then the bilby. Each one of these animals are native to Australia and not found anywhere else on the earth. And so that begs the question as to why. Why does Australia have so many unique animals that are different from anywhere else? If we look at the koala and the kangaroo, probably the most common feature that they have is that they're marsupials, which means that their young grow in a pouch. And so when we try to figure out this question of why they're so different, the reason being is because they grew up in isolation for 130 million years. The evolution has taken on a different course in Australia as a result of the climate, the vegetation, and their location based on where they're at on Earth. At this point now, what I'd like you to do is pause the video again and start to write down your geoterms. The continental drift theory, which we just talked about. Endangered species, which means animals or plants that are in danger of dying out in the immediate future. Exotic species, animals or plants that are brought into an area from somewhere else. Native species, and threatened species. Please write those down. Please draw a picture in the symbol box and write a sentence. At this point, you should have your geoterms done and should have read section 1 and 2. We will now start talking about section 3. I would like you to take notes on your packet that you have been given. You'll notice that your notes ask you to do a little bit different. They're going to ask you to brainstorm what you think that the connection might be between Australia and Great Britain, and then look at the pictures and then do this and do that. We're not going to follow those guidelines or those directions. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to read section 3. You're going to do that on your own. And then we're going to talk about what we learned from section 3. Please read or skim section 3 right now. What I'd like you to write down on your paper is here. This is what you really need to know about this group. Alright? Now the first thing that we're going to talk about are the Aborigines. The Aborigines came to Australia about 40,000 years ago, and they're the oldest culture in the world. All right, these are the oldest. This is the culture that follows the same patterns, the same way of life that they have done for 40,000 years. Many of you guys may ask, well, how did they get to Australia? It is believed that groups of people had traveled from originally Asia, and then to the islands surrounding. Remember, in your mapping lab, we called that area Oceania, and then eventually migrated using boats, canoes, whatever it was that they were sailing on, into Australia and started their own culture. In 1778, we see that this area became a prison colony for Great Britain. Yes, that is correct, a prison colony. You'll notice that 1778 corresponds with the American Revolution. All right, and that took place in 1776, or at least started in 1776. Unfortunately for the British, America was one of their biggest places that they sent their prisoners. Georgia was a prison colony. So after that, they had to find a new place. So they sent 11 ships with 700 convicts. Now it started out small from there. But then in 1851, gold was discovered in Australia, and thousands of treasure hunters were entered Australia. Many of the Aborigines died as a result of this. Now you may ask yourself, well, why did the Aborigines die? Well, yes, their land was taken over. Yes, there was some conflict and fighting where they were killed. But more so what happened is disease. The immune system of the Aborigines was not adapted to that of the Europeans. And so when the Europeans came there, they brought diseases with them. And that led to thousands of people dying. Now we see a number of British influences as a result of this. One of the biggest ones that we see, all right, is this right here in the Australian flag, and that is the Union Jack. So when you see people wearing the shirts, you see them wearing the jackets, you see them holding the British flag, that is the Union Jack, this portion right here. Now you'll also see the stars, all right? These stars are going to represent the night sky of Australia. Australians also speak English. They do have the Australian accent, but their base of it is English. They still honor the monarch. And they also have similar customs and laws. We'll see that Australia does have a constitution. They have a prime minister, as they do in Great Britain. And they also have a very similar court system. The court system that we know of in America is very similar to that of Great Britain. At this point, I'd like you to now look at Section 4, the new relationship with neighbors. Please read or skim the section and then restart this video. In your notes, what we'd like to know is this portion. These are the things that we want to know about Australia and their new relationship with neighbors. Each one of the colonies of Great Britain, so America, India, South Africa, and Australia, all went through a period of segregation. Now, segregation is a period of time when races, whether they be black and white, which is the most common, are segregated or separated between one another. Now, in Australia, their worry was more so from Asia and the Aborigines. And so what they did in Australia is they had what was known as the White Australia. And this was an immigration policy which meant immigrants had to pass a dictation test. Now, a dictation test is one in which you have to, you're given an oral passage read out loud, and then the people would have to write it down. Well, if you're from England, this is pretty easy because everyone was educated and they spoke English. If you were from Asia, if you were from Japan, Korea, Indochina, Malaysia, or any one of these other countries, this was very difficult. And so it really prevented a lot of people from moving in. By the 1970s, the White Australia immigration policy came under a lot of scrutiny. And as a result, the country opened its doors to other immigrants. Now we can see over here in this graph, this is the largest group of, these are the groups of immigrants that are now traveling to Australia. One of the things that I'd really like you to pay attention to is the large number of people that are coming from Asia, from Japan, from China, all right, New Zealand, from Korea, South Asia, India. The number of Europeans has drastically decreased. And the United States, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and then finally this other. And what you're going to notice is that because of its proximity, because of its closeness to Asia here, this is why so many people are traveling there. From America, you're looking at about a 24-hour flight. So not only are you going to have to fly, if you're flying from Chicago into LA or San Diego, then you also have to fly all the way down to Australia. It takes about 24 hours. And the same is true when you're coming from Europe. And so because of its proximity, because of its relative location of this area, most of their neighbors are now coming from here in Asia. We're going to move on to Section 5. Again, I'd like you to read or skim this section for the reversed seasons. Australia is in the southern hemisphere, which means they are going to have the opposite season of us. So if we remember our world that we drew before, and we think about our equator, the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere are going to have opposite seasons. If we're in winter, they're in summer. If we're in summer, they're in winter. Okay? So this is going to explain why when we look at these pictures here, we see Santa Claus is surfing on the beach. And when we think about June and our summer break, they're skiing the slopes of the closest mountain. And it's because they live in the opposite hemisphere, they're going to have the opposite seasons of us. All right? We've talked about this since the beginning of the semester. Now this gives them a seasonal advantage, especially with countries or places in the northern hemisphere. And if we think about where they're located, really not many major countries, cities are located in the southern hemisphere. Really most of them are in the northern hemisphere. So for a country like Australia, this allows them to export opposite season fruits and vegetables, as well as draw tourists to their country. So there's a huge market for both of these things, for the fruits and veggies and for it being a tourist destination. And that's why these beach activities are such a big deal in Australia, especially in December, January, and February. When it's really cold up here, or in the northern hemisphere, it's really warm in the southern hemisphere. And so Australia is able to take advantage of that. Now we'll look at Section 6, Australia's Amazing Wildlife. Please read Section 6 or skim it, and then replay this video. There are many unique animals that live in Australia because of the continental drift. Remember, Australia has been in isolation for about 130, 140 million years, and as a result of evolution, the animals have grown unique and have adapted to the climate and the area of which they live. Now we see this bird here, the kookaburra. The kookaburra, which is right here, is only found in Australia. To be honest with you, I'm not sure of much of what makes it unique, but the kookaburra is unique to Australia. Now this one down here you're probably a little bit more familiar with, and it's a duck-billed platypus. We know and we can see clearly that this looks like a combination between a beaver and a duck. And so this is quite unique. Over here we see the marsupials. You'll see the sugar glider, which, by the way, if you're thinking of buying a sugar glider, they're nocturnal. It means they sleep all day and then they run around making their crazy noises all night. So just think about that before you buy them. We also see a number of other different marsupials. There are thousands of marsupials in Australia. All right, there's about 7. I believe your book says there's like 7 million different plants and animal species in the world, and over 1 million of them reside in Australia, and at least 1 million of them are unique to Australia. That's kind of interesting and kind of important. All right, again, these marsupials, what makes them unique is this pouch that their babies grow in. We see that many of these animals are also endangered, which means that if not protected, they could become extinct or no longer available on Earth. Think about the dinosaurs are extinct. All right, so they're not here anymore. Same thing could happen to these. One of my favorite ones is the Tasmanian devil. Now I feel as though I've been lied to my entire life, because this is what I was told is a Tasmanian devil. This is what they really look like. All right? So you can see where I'm a little disappointed with their character and size and really powers of destruction. The Tasmanian devil I grew up with could destroy anything. This guy doesn't look like so much. Section 7, Living Under an Ozone Hole. Again, I'd like you to pause here, read or skim Section 7. Alright, air pollution equals the ozone hole, and it's as a result of CFCs. Especially during the 70s and the 80s, when aerosol cans became very popular, they were filled with CFCs. And so during that time, those were being released in huge abundance. Many people believe that this caused the ozone hole to weaken over time. And we can clearly see in this area right here and this area right here the color variance and differences. Now we want that ozone area to look more like this area right here with that dark green. And even in here, this purple, as we see from this graph, is bad. Alright, and that's something that we don't want to see happening. Unfortunately for Australia, they spend a portion of their year with that ozone hole directly overhead. Now the continent that you're seeing right here, this is Antarctica. For a few months though, every year, this ozone hole will shift. This ozone hole will shift over into this area and will expose Australia. Now the real danger with this is the amount of UVA and UVB rays that are now able to come directly through without being diminished by the ozone. And the incidence of cancer rates or skin cancer rates of Australia are astronomical. There is a direct correlation or connection between that ozone hole and skin cancer rates, and it's alarming in Australia. As a result, Australia has created or adopted, kind of like our Smokey the Bear, this duck. And he is the slip, the slop, and the slap campaign slogan And what this means is that you should slip on a shirt, slap on some sunscreen, and slap on a hat. And it says it isn't just skin cancer, it's a killer. Kids in school are not allowed outside to go play during recess without a hat. SPF 30 or higher is recommended, and I've heard that in Australia you can even find as high as SPF 150. And so if you're fair-skinned, this is a major deal. All right, this is a big deal, and this is something that can really affect the way that people live and how their health is. This is the end of the video, and so by this point you should have a good idea that living in Australia really makes the culture, the animals, and the plants unique, and it's as a result of their geography that has created this. Had Australia not been where it's at, had not separated from the rest of the world 130 million years ago, life there, animals there, and plants there would look completely different. And so this is just another example of how the relative location of where people live and where the country is located affects culture and affects the people, the animals, and everything else about a place. If you still have any questions, please ask myself or Miss Mahoney. But please make sure that your packets are completed and all filled out, and you'll be using these to fill out your study guide at the end of the week.